The Vedic civilization. Vedas and Vedic literature. The Vedas are the earliest literary compositions in India. Veda is derived from Vid, which means to know. The four Vedas are Rig Veda, Samaveda, Atharva Veda, and Yajur Veda. Other literature arising from the Vedas are Brahmanas, Aranyakas, Upanishads, Puranas, Ramayana, and Mahabharata. This entire literature is called Vedic literature. The Vedic age is from 1500 to 600 BCE. This is divided into early and late Vedic periods. The early Vedic period is from 1500 to 1000 BCE, and the late Vedic period is from 1000 to 600 BCE. The Aryans settled in North India. India was then called Bharatavarsha after an Aryan tribe called Bharata. The early Vedic period. The people lived in Sapt Sindhu, which is today Haryana and Punjab. There were 7 rivers in this area: Indus, Jhelum, Chenab, Ravi, Bias, Satluj, and Saraswati, which is now dried up. It is called the Rig Vedic age. The Rig Veda was composed at that time. It has 1028 hymns. Knowledge was passed orally, called Shruti. Political life in the early Vedic period. There were tribal groups, and each group lived in a village called Grama. They fought wars called Gavasti over cattle. Rajan was the tribal chief. He received bali or donations for his work. His assistants were the commander-in-chief, which was the Senani, the chief priest or the Purohit, the village headman called the Gramani, and he held meetings in the Sabha, which consisted of the committee of elders, and the Samiti, which is the General Assembly. Life of people in the early Vedic age. The occupation was mostly farming, and they grew wheat, barley, and rice. Cattle rearing was also done. Somewhere in the literature it also mentions potters, weavers, leather workers, carpenters. They used horses and chariots, and their amusements included chariot race, hunting, gambling, music, and dancing. The social life. They had joint families, and there was a patriarchal system in which the senior most father was the head of the whole family. Women were respected, and Gargi and Maitreyi were famous women in this era. The Varna system. Earlier, society was based on color. The Aryans were fair, the Dasas were dark. But later on, social division was based on occupation, and therefore the caste system came about. And Varna means caste. There were 4 Varnas: the Brahmins or the priests, the Kshatriyas or the kings and warriors, the Vaishyas or the farmers and craftsmen, and the Shudras, which were the slaves and those that were disobedient to the rulers. Religion of the early Vedic age. First, they worshipped forces of nature. Therefore, they had gods like Prithvi, which means earth, Agni, which means fire, Vayu, which means wind, Indra, which means rain, Surya, which means sun, and Varun, which means sky. Of these, Indra was the most important god. There were no idols at that time, and there were simple rituals performed in open air. In the later Vedic age, they learned the use of iron, and they lived toward Kurukshetra and Hastinapur on banks of the river Yamuna. They slowly spread along the northern Gangetic plain because they could clear out the forests using the new iron tools. And they later moved to Kosala in UP and Videha in Bihar. The Samaveda, Atharva Veda, and Yajur Veda were composed during this time. The political life in the later Vedic age. The king was also called the Samrat or the Maharajadhi Raja. He was a supreme commander and chief justice. He performed sacrifices which were called yajnas. Example, he would perform the Raja Surya Yajna, which was to gain power, and he would perform Ashwamedha Yajna to expand his kingdom. The women lost importance at this time, and they could not attend meetings. Sabhas and Samitis also lost importance at this time. Life of the people in the later Vedic age. Agriculture improved because of the use of iron plows. The iron was called black metal or sham ayas. Weaving, leatherwork, pottery, carpentry, and jewelry making were done at this time. The amusements included dancing, singing, racing, and gambling. The male head of the family now started being worshipped. Women of upper class got education, but the women were considered inferior to men. The caste system became rigid and hereditary. The stages of life of an Aryan. These were also called the ashramas. The first was the brahmacharya or the student life. Then was the family life called the garhastha, derived from the word gar, which means house. Vanaprastha, which means retirement time in which the man had to go to the forest to meditate. Sannyasa was the time of complete retirement. Religion in the later Vedic age. Indra, Varun, and Agni gods lost their importance, and this was replaced by the Trinity, which was Brahma, also called Prajapati, Vishnu, which was the preserver, and Shiva, the destroyer. It was a complex religious worship, and complex rituals and sacrifices started being performed. And Hinduism, as of today, began to take shape during this period. Education. The girls were educated at home. The boys' student life began with the thread ceremony called the Upnayana. After this, he was called Dvija or twice born. And after this, he went to the Gurukul to spend his student life living with his Guru. The students would serve their Guru in exchange for knowledge. Oral knowledge was passed in Sanskrit, and grammar, maths, astronomy, warfare, music, and architecture were taught. Literature. Sama, Yajur, and Athurva Veda were composed during this time. Their supplementaries were also composed at this time. The Upanishads stress the importance of understanding the relationship of Atma or self with God. The Puranas dealt with the origins of the universe and of gods and sages and ruling families. Mahabharata included Bhagavad Gita, which was the essence of Hindu philosophy. The differences between early and late Vedic periods. The ruler in the early Vedic period was called the Rajan, and the late Vedic period it was called Samrat or Maharajadi Raja. Early Vedic period, the occupation was mostly farming and cattle rearing, and the cow was sometimes used as a barter unit. So you gave one cow in exchange of something else that you wanted. In the late Vedic period, there was improved agriculture due to the use of iron plows. There was also carpentry, weaving, chariot making, and jewelry making. The religion. In the early Vedic period, they were nature worshippers. So Indra was the main god. There were no idols, and simple rituals were performed in open air. The Rig Veda was composed during this time. The late Vedic period, they stopped worshipping nature and they did not give it so much importance. But instead, they worshipped Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, which was the Trinity. And idols started being made, and complex rituals and sacrifices called yajnas started to be performed. What about the women? The women could attend assemblies and prayer, and they had a position of respect in the early Vedic period. But in the late Vedic period, they were regarded inferior to men, though they had to attend some religious ceremonies. The caste system began in the early Vedic period and was based on occupation. Initially, it was based on color, but then it became based on occupation. And there were the Brahmans, Kshatriyas, Vaishyas, and Shudras. And this same caste system became very rigid and hereditary during the late Vedic period.